this particular metal bar is actually a solid piece, but I've decided I want mine to be a little bit more interesting, so I'm going to put lightning holes in these. Lightning holes simply are things to make the metal lighter, not something to do with the weather, but to make it lighter, not as heavy. You see this all the time in aircraft and things like that, where the fuselage struts and stuff have holes in the bars. That's just to make this to conserve on weight. And the next thing to do is to enlarge these holes. And again, I'm going to be kind of precise about this. So again, looking at my reference photographs, I can tell that along the upper and lower edges of this, there's basically some iron across the top here, strengthening rods basically. And so what I'm going to do is just simply clad the top and the bottom with pieces of this styrene from the Evergreen collection here. And just to make it a little bit more interesting, I'm going to use two sizes. They're both thickness is 0.20, but the width is 0.6 and 0.8. And I'm going to go ahead and, from the reference photograph, that looks like there's a little bit more of an overhang on the upper edge than the lower edge. So I'll use, actually these are backwards, but I'll use the wider, the 080 along the top edge and the 060 along the bottom edge. I'll show you on the bottom edge too, because there's a little bit of a, if you remember before, we were talking about the flexibility of the styrene, right, and we're going to use that to our advantage now, because we want to be able to contour around those edges there, those corners. Don't want to fight the entire length, but I'm just going to go ahead and cut a piece that's slightly longer than what my final product's going to be. Okay, so we've got our glue on here and it's dried here for a few minutes. I'm ready to go ahead and finish off this section here. I'm going to tap it down, make sure it's all nice and snug. And then the same way we did before, I'm just going to apply this glue under this edge here. And then that bottom part's done. Now it's still wet and we don't want to handle it too much, but I think if I'm careful, I can go ahead and add that top strip on. If you remember, we're going to use the little bit wider 080 this time, because I see in my reference that it just had a little bit more of a shadow on that top. And that's really what I'm going by. I saw a little bit more shadow, so we're going to assume it was a little bit wider. This is pretty much all the materials we're going to need for this next little segment here. A little bit of flat cardstock that we'll get into a little bit later. And we're going to start with, if you remember, first piece we cut was that width right across the top there, and that's this little piece of angle iron right there. So what we're going to do is, like we talked about doing before, we're going to start at the back because we knew that width. This is the one that we knew. And we're just going to attach it here and attach the other side on the other side there. And that will give us our starting spot, because we don't really know the angle yet and how this is all going to go together. So rather than trying to guess, we'll just let the process tell us. So I'm just going to go ahead and glue this, glue this to the top up here. Again, I'm using angle iron just because it looks kind of cool. Kind of hold that in place for a second. And you want that to be more or less perpendicular. And we're going to let that dry for just a moment. And then we'll see a little, scoot that up there so it's nice and tight. And this is going to take just a second to dry enough for us to get working on it. And crack it back. And we'll do the same thing on the other side. In this case, I'll just put a little bit of glue up here where I want this to adhere to. And here we go. And that will give us our angle. But it's a little on the soft side still, so I'm going to kind of do this. I want them to meet there. So now we go. So now we've got our triangle of our boom. It's just that simple. I'm going to let that glue kind of hold it here for a second, and then we'll tack up the front corners where my left hand is sitting, and then we'll hold that in place. What I want to do now is I want to get this corner angle figured out. And I don't really know what that is yet, but I just want to make sure that I get that tacked together so that this dries properly. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to worry about size so much. I'm just going to cut myself a small piece. Break it off. And I'm just going to say, okay, I want a plate that goes across the top there, somewhere about there. And I'm just going to go ahead and glue that. And I'll use the piece itself, the parts, to use as my template. So my concern right now is simply two things. I want this to be even back here, and I want it to look straight up front and come to a point. And what I'm going to do is lay this across here, make sure that looks straight and even. I can see right here that these 2 points are at the same place. Now they are.
Right.
So I'm going to have to flip this over slightly so I can see. Let's bring those together. Hold it in place. Now it's just a little bit of fine adjusting because I just want these things to be equal. And I'll do the same thing for this bottom side. And then again we'll just start decorating it up so it looks like it's bolted onto these rails. Okay, so I'm back here. What you see is that first plate that we were working on, I've gone ahead and the glue is set up enough and I've cut it to size, and I've added another piece on the bottom, just a piece of styrene, same width as the first one, and it's glued on and the glue is dried now, so I'm just going to go ahead and cut that to size in the same way as I did the first one. All I'm doing here is following the side of the piece itself and tapping it off. And this way, like I said, we don't have to worry about guessing what the sizes are going to be and making measurements. We just let the part itself tell us what it needs to be. So one of the quick finishing steps we want to do at this point is, before we get too much clutter on here, we want to take care of a little bit of sanding just to sharpen this thing up a little bit. So if you remember, we had these lightning holes that we left kind of messy. So what we would do is simply get a piece of sandpaper, fold it so it can get in here, and I just kind of give a quick twist in these holes just to get some of the little extra pieces and fibers out of there. And then along this top area up here, you can see there's a little bit of unevenness along this edge here, and I want these to look like plates. And if you notice, metal plates, they're not necessarily real sharp angles anyway, so we're going to kind of put these back so it's all lined up, same way as we did with the parts when we made them initially. And I'm going to actually kind of give them just a little bit of a softer, rounded edge on them. And it's interesting because just a little bit of softness on those edges will actually make pieces of plastic look more like metal. I'm very lightly sanding here, so there's not a lot of pressure. I'm just kind of...
Yeah, you're right. It actually does look a lot more like metal now. Just a simple rounding of the corners there.
Yeah. I think what I'll do is grab another piece of plastic here, and I'm going to lay this across here, and I'm going to go ahead and butt this one edge up here against the side so that I don't have to trim two sides, I just have to trim one side. Okay, we're back, and I've got this plate on here, and I've sanded it back a little bit just to get a little bit better scale to it all. Anything like this type of a structure would have some sort of cross support through here, so I'm going to go ahead and add those real quick. So let's go ahead and move back up to the front here where we're going to have like a towing hook, and we're going to do that by using a piece of a little bit thicker material here. And most towing hooks that I see have kind of a rounded nose to them and a hole in the center, and then they put some cable or a clamp or something through it. So we're going to do the same thing here. What we're going to do, though, kind of think about this and how it makes it easier for you to work. If I were to cut this to size right now and try to hold it and sand this, that'd be really difficult to hold on to. So I'm just going to head and leave this as one piece right now, and I'm going to sand off my corners to make this a little bit kind of a rounded bullnose looking thing. Drill a hole in this thing as well. And then I could, if I wanted to, just go ahead and make a horizontal cut across here to the size. And I reintroduce our tool here. Whenever you're making something, this is that chopper again, I don't know if you remember this from the very beginning introduction, but whenever you're making a cut that you want to make sure is nice and horizontal, or perpendicular I should say, then this is a nice tool, because I'm able to put this right against this retaining bridge right here, make sure that's nice and straight, and I know that this is going to come down nice and straight as well. So basically all I have to do is decide how long I want this piece to be and come down and cut it off. A little bit of pressure, and there it is. So I'm just going to go ahead and use the liquid cement to my advantage, because what it does, liquid cement by its very nature softens the styrene. Okay, so we're going to let that dry. We can real quickly move on to some other steps here. You know, any time you do construction, of course, somehow all these plates and bits and pieces get attached. Either they're welded or bolted on. And we could show weld seams if we wanted to, but we're not going to do that this time. I've decided, because it's a lot more fun to weather around bolts, and probably that's what they would have used in the field, something real quick, is I'm going to add some bolt heads across here in certain places so it looks like these things are actually attached, not just by magic, but with real tools. what I've got here is a little punch and die set. Now, punch and die sets are fairly common. A lot of people use them for a lot of different purposes in industry. This particular one is scaled down a little bit, so the various holes here are different sizes that are more relevant to what we do in our work. Then we have these punches, and this particular one comes with a set of punches from very small to very large. And then simply all we do in order to make a bunch of little rivets is we find the appropriate size punch that we want to use, which goes in the hole, put a piece of styrene that's got the thickness that we want to use. This case is like a 20 thousandths, and we just push them through. And we're going to go ahead and do this a number of times, and what's happening is, let's see, it's punching holes through here and underneath. So those are the little rivets that we've been making. Obviously these are tough to hold on to at this point, so again with a sharp blade, I moistened it with my tongue again. I've pre-dampened this section right here with a little bit of super glue, or excuse me, liquid glue, the plastic glue. I'm just going to touch one of these, and a matter of just placing it where I want to place it. And there it is.
Right on.
And I'm going to do another one here, because this one's a big piece. Over here it's got 2 rivets into it. Okay, so what we've got here now, I've gone ahead and added some more little rivets on various places, including the underside and all the other supports behind us here. I've also added this little towing area that we were talking about, where I rounded it off and adhered it to the edge here, drilled a hole through it. And then later on in construction, this boom is held in place or extended by this cable or whatever that comes from a point at the end and goes up behind the tractor and connects to something else. We'll get to that later. But anyway, so I added that little part as well. And that was simply drilled out a piece of plastic and then cut it in half and then set it there and make a little loop. So the last little piece I'm going to detail up in the front here is, in real life, if you're going to kind of play our game here of what if and how would they do that, is that this particular piece here, rather than being plated on like this, would probably be welded on. There'd be weld seams along the edge here on both sides. So we're going to go ahead and do that real quick. And the easy way to do that is you take some thin plastic rod like we have here. This is 20 thousandths. This is perfect for this. I'm going to cut off a little piece. Actually 2 pieces, one for either side. And then we're going to use this glue to our advantage again. So we're going to flood this area here. We're going to go ahead and tap this in here, just like that. And we'll do the same on the other side. So I'm going to let that set for just a minute, and we're going to come back to that. Well, while that's drying, we're going to move on to a little bit more, because we're getting ready now to actually attach this onto our piece here. I've got a piece of plastic here that I'm going to use that's going to look like a piece of steel plate. Not very thick, but I'm going to go ahead and do that real quick. And for that, I'm just going to go ahead and do it the short and sweet way. So like that. And then I'm going to go ahead and lay this one on the top of this one for my measurement. Oops. And see what I'm doing here? I'm actually cutting behind the other cut onto this way of it. So now they'll both be exactly the same. I'm not using that as a template. I'm just cutting both at the same time. So now I've got 2 exact pieces. And what I'm going to do is apply them right here as some sort of a steel plate. So I'm just going to go ahead and, since this is plastic, I'm just going to go ahead and do that real quick. Actually, before I do that, remember our rule about making things a little bit angular or rounded. We're going to go ahead and do that. Just subtle, not a lot of rounding, but just enough to kind of soften those edges. And I'm just going to go ahead and attach this down here. I'm going to go below that bracket that I see right there. So my mental notes that I'm making myself so I can even this on the other side is it's underneath this bracket and flush with the front here. And the rest of it will take care of itself. Okay, well, as you can see here, we're back, and we've got all these the little front pintle thing glued together right now. And I've also taken some time and I've added what would basically be little metal brackets, for lack of better, onto the sides of the vehicle here, and made some little extensions onto the frame itself. And we're going to use these as our attachment points. We'll dress these up with some bolts and such, so it looks like it's been affixed somehow Not sure how, but you know, it's a lot of this is just about illusion. Let's make it look like it could work, and therefore it does work. So one last little piece of something we'll try out here real quick is when I was working on this section here, it really, to be more accurate, this section right here would be welded on versus screwed on or bolted onto the front of this frame here. So I thought make some little weld beads right along these corners here, and what I've done is I've applied some 20 thousandths of that rod. So this is a little bit of round strip from the evergreen stuff, and once again I'm using the liquid glue to soften the plastic. And I'm going to wait for just a second here, and the glue will just make those little round pieces soft. And then what I'm going to do is just with this edge with my knife, just going to start making those little weld marks into here. And that soft plastic just takes these. And I'll do it a couple of times, and then it just kind of squishes down in there. And I know it's hard to see now because it's white on white, but once we get a little bit of paint on that, it will look just like a weld. Get the other side here. Remember?
Right, yeah, I can compare from this side how different that looks. And
anyway, just a little added detail to make this look a little bit busier.
it does look a lot better just like that. Wow.
And you can see now we've got our other bolts all attached on top here. Same with on the bottom. Nice and uniform because we use that punch, and then it's just eyeballed them onto position. So right now we're just simply going to glue this onto the front using our glue, and then we'll just line this one up and line the other one up and kind of pinch them together. And it's in real life what's happening here, you can see this little bit of an angle that it's making here, and maybe that's not very realistic either.
Right.
But we're going to go ahead and let that one slide right now. Again, scratch building is one of those things where you can make compromises or not make compromises along the way. So if you decide you really wanted this to work and be able to lift up and down, you can certainly put working bolts and washers and such in there so this would work, you know, as it would in real life.
Okay, so you can see there we put the bolts on, and I guess you did the welding seams again on the bolts there?
No, actually what I've done is I've made, using that punch and die, I've made two sizes of holes and put one on top of the other one so it looks kind of like a washer and a bolt sort of thing.
Right.
And then just the small ones up here on front.
Okay, really nice.
Okay, so now we're fairly finished up here. We've got most of the details on, certainly the basic structure. So now it's time to start working on the back. And again, looking at the reference photograph, they've put some sort of a roof structure onto this thing to keep them dry, being that it's an open top vehicle. So we're going to do something similar. Not exactly following the reference photograph, but we'll make a roof for this thing and kind of simulate that whole idea anyway. So one of the first things I have done in preparation is along this back edge here there was little bolts similar to these that ran down in 3 points on either side. Well, what I'm going to do is use this corner as a support and glue on some support beams up here, so I need to remove those surface details first. So I've done that, and now I'm just going to simply take some of my channel, this is that L bracket stuff, and I'm just going to glue these up, and we're going to pretend like they've used the frame of the bench seat here as their support for their roof. So we'll glue one on this side, and we'll repeat it on the other side here. Just like that. So that becomes our roof height. And then what we want to do is we want to put some sort of a support in between here. And we'll just do that, and I'm going to, again, we're letting the pieces tell us how big it's going to be. We're not going to worry about measuring it. Although we could take the calipers and span that gap and get an exact measurement. But this will be fine. So I got a little light pencil mark there that I'm just going to go ahead and cut down on. So I'll stick a little bit of glue. Oops, probably too much glue. Wipe some of that back so I can get my fingers into it. And then we're just going to put that here and here. And when we get a little further along, we'll re-add these bolts along this back corner here, along the side, so it looks like this in fact is attached to this bench seat. Okay, as you can see, I continued working on this for just a few moments when I was off camera. These are the side posts that you saw me putting up a moment ago. And to that I added the cross member here. And then I'm kind of thinking ahead just a little bit here. If I put a solid roof on this at this stage of the game, I'm going to have a very difficult time with my paintbrush getting in here to paint out the details. So I've purposely made this into a sort of a framework right now to hold the roof later on, a solid roof, that I can still get a paintbrush down in here to paint the seat and some of the handles and things like that. But the framework for the roof itself is complete, so now all I need to do is make a top cap for this and make it look, you know, like a solid piece. What we're going to do is take our piece and we're going to dress up the edges here to make a little bit of a trim on this. So for that, I've already cut out some pieces of strip that are the same size along these edges here. And what I could do is simply just adhere these to the edges and make a little bit of a trim molding, basically. But I want to make it a little bit more interesting, and what I want to do is give a little bit of a slope to this roof for a little bit of rain and interest, rain shedding and interest. So literally I'm going to bend this slightly, but how I'm going to do that is similar to how we did it on the tractor earlier, where I bent the strips around the bottom up here. We're going to do the same thing with the trim molding here. So what I've got are two pieces of this trim molding that are the same length as my side piece here, as you can see. And I've got two marks on it, and the two marks represent the center of this strip, or I shouldn't say the center, the part where I want it to bend from, down to the center down here. And what I want to do is cut a line diagonal across this and a slope. So I'm going to line up my blade here to up there and put pressure down. And I got through one, I'm hoping to get through the other. There we go. So now I've got two pieces with a slope on them. So I'm going to pull these apart, perhaps. Double-sided tape is a wonderful tool, but can be frustrating. There we go. So, in a similar manner as we did it before. So what we're going to do is basically glue this on upside down, starting with the wide spot up here. And we're going to get to a point up here, and then we're going to start bending, literally bending the roof to match the contour of this angle. I'm going to just lay that along the edge here. Just lay it in there. Okay, and then along this back edge, while these are drying, I'm just going to go apply this last piece of trim, and I'll just do that directly to here.
Okay.
And I should be able to just set this into here. The next step here, we're going to have to let this dry for just a moment, and we'll come right back. We'll bend this up and add the front piece of trim. As you can see, we've went ahead and tacked down the top to this little bit of a slope here along this edge here, and along the front we've added that last piece of trim, and now we've got a little bit of an interesting profile to our roof. The other thing we've done on this side is just went ahead and made just a little sort of a winch. On the reference photograph there's a cable that runs up to a kind of a pivot point up here just on a pole and down to the front of the boom just to kind of hold it steady. So I went ahead and scratch built that out of just a few pieces of the plastic, a little bit of a round tube, and some other pieces just sanded around the corners as you've seen me do before.
And how long did that winch take you to make? We actually made that off screen. How long did that take you to make?
Oh, about a minute.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, I just cut a couple pieces of tube, or one piece of tube, and just a few pieces of the flat piece, and a couple scraps. This little piece right here is just a scrap from the bar that I put up there. I literally just threw it together for this demonstration. And also you can see I've went ahead and added those little bolt heads back onto that post where we'd scraped them off from before.
Right.
So now it looks like it's part of the, it's been attached in some sort of a mechanical way. So this is simply a piece that will, when we finish up, will just sit on top. And there we go. And this will be our finished model that now we're ready to start painting. Okay, so now we're getting ready to start the painting of the model, and we're going to start with just a little bit of an overview and introduction of some of the tools I'll be using throughout the process. And as I introduce more things, I'll try to stop and let you know why I'm using what I'm using and such. the two basic things, or the first thing I'm going to really start using is an airbrush here. And of course, it's connected to an air pressure tank that's sitting here beside my desk, and I'm shooting at about 25 psi. This is one of those things where, depending on the type of work you're doing and your comfort level, you can change the psi to suit your needs. I have two types of airbrushes here. This is an Iwata, and this is one from MIG Productions. This is a top load brush, which means basically the cup is on top. It's gravity fed, so just gravity siphons it down into the chamber here. And this is a bottom feed, this Iwata here, and it basically sucks the paint up here and mixes it with the air and squirts out. These are both dual action or double action airbrushes, which means that there's a turn it on for the air and a pull back to allow the flow to go through. And you can see I have a little water in it, and so it's, as I pulled it back, the water starts to come out. So it's very versatile because you can basically just blow air over something to dry it off, or you can easily just ease into it if you're trying to make a fine line. And that's important when you start doing airbrush work, is, once again, buy the best brush you possibly can. Single action means you simply just push the button and go.
Okay, is the MIG Productions a dual action as well?
It is. They're both dual action brushes.
Why would one person supposedly buy an Iwata over a MIG?
Well, there's a number of airbrush companies out there, and a number of them are very, very good. Iwata, Badger, the MIG Productions is one that they just did for themselves a few years ago. It's no longer in production. I happen to have one. Again, there's a number of brushes out there. You're going to want, again, for instance, Iwata makes a huge range of airbrushes for a lot of different applications, from doing fingernails to doing automotive paint schemes and all sorts of things, you know, the literally industrial sized brushes. But they do have a range for the hobbyist. And within that range, there's a number of very good brushes, and the difference between the brushes a lot of times has to do with the cup size that they provide. Like I was saying before, either gravity fed from the top or siphon feed from the bottom. You just want to find one that's comfortable in your hand. Different companies, there's a little bit different way that you'll hold the brush, the trigger mounts work. Some actually have a trigger on the bottom that's more like a pistol. Some people find that more easy to work with.
Which particular model is this one?
This is the Eclipse HPBS BCS. It's not their most expensive brand, or top of the line. Like I said, it's the best I could afford at the time.
Right.
It's right in the middle of the pack, basically. Both of these have fine tips on them. That to me was important, because a lot of the work I do is finer work, tighter camouflages, trying to pick out spots without having to do a lot of masking. So to me, that was more important than maybe the next level up. But any of these brushes, you can switch out the components on the inside, so you can put a different needle. Let's see if I can do this real quick. If you these all break apart for cleaning, and the needle is basically right inside here, and it pulls back and forth. You can see it kind of moving back and forth in the tip there. And this is an adjustment mechanism back here. They both have it. This one adjusts back here, and those allow you to adjust the flow of the paint and really basically dial it into how you want it to act in your hands.
Right, so that's more of a static adjustment.
Yeah.
This is the dynamic adjustment with the finger.
Right. This will set, basically you'll set this up at the beginning of a session, or they stay locked. So in my case, I've got this pushed pretty far all the way forward, and what that means is that when I push the trigger, I'm only going to get air. I know that. If I would adjust this, roll this back, pull it back slightly, and relock it, this needle would slide back in within the cover right there.
Right.
And that would allow a little bit of product to go through, a little bit of paint to go through, even if I just push it down without pulling back. And as you can see, mine is right up, it's blocking the entire flow coming through there. So I have to pull back to allow any sort of paint to come through.
Right.
And that's just the way I like it. Some people, they're doing different types of application. They just want to push the button and go.
Right.
And that would be acting more similar to a single action, where you basically push the button and go. For the general hobbyist, I think you're looking at anywhere between, for a decent brush, something in the range that I'm showing here, you're looking between $100 and $200.
Okay.
So
very cool.
The next part of this is, obviously, we're going to do a lot of brush work. And I mentioned this at the very beginning, is that you want to buy the best brushes you possibly can afford. I kind of say that hypocritically, because not all these brushes are the best brushes you can afford. One in here in particular, though, is, if I can find it real quick. Maybe it's off to the side, but I'll point it out when I get to it. I have a fine brush, very fine brush, that is a very nice brush. When I say best you can afford, it's about $20. That's this one right here.
Windsor Newton Series 7.
Yeah, it's this little Series 7 right here. It's about a $20 brush. I've had this thing for about 5 years, and you can see the tip on it is still pretty good.
Right, that's actually one of the brushes that almost all the miniature painters use, is the Series 7 by Windsor Newton. We're very familiar with that brush.
Yeah, good. Well, I'm glad to see I've got good company.
Yeah, it's an excellent brush.
So then the rest of these brushes, they're kind of middle of the road brushes, and part of the reason for that, for me personally, is I have access to a lot of paint brushes. I happen to work for a company that makes paint brushes, so and the range that they offer is kind of middle of the road, and I can just have a new brush whenever I want one. So I'm kind of spoiled in that regard. But what's important to me is the types of brushes, and they basically come down to two different types of brushes. You've got a round tip, like this one here, and then you've got a flat. So the difference here between round brushes and flat brushes, you want a mix of both in different sizes because they're going to do different things for you. A fine brush like this, or that Series 7, that's going to be for very fine work, for very precise painting, and you'll see when the work I do, that's for creating little paint chips and things like that. So you want a real fine brush that just puts the paint exactly where you want it. These round brushes, like the little larger ones here, those are for general overall painting. We'll go ahead and we'll add washes with those types of brushes. We'll paint larger elements, like maybe the seat of this tractor, things like that. The flat brushes, we can do some general painting with those, but a lot of what I use those for, when we get into working with the oil paints and some of the washes and filters, those are used to blend. I use those a lot for blending or streaking down different surfaces. And later we'll show you that we're going to do some chipping and stuff using some chemicals, and those work well for that. And finally, I wanted to show you a couple of things, which is basically never throw away your brushes. So these brushes here have been shot to hell. I mean, I've used these for years, and they're all just dead, and you can see these are all splayed out here where it really can't get much precise painting. But I'll be using pigments and oils and things like that later on that need a real aggressive touch, and it really doesn't matter what the brush looks like. It's more the shape of the brush. I really like this brush here in particular for applying pigments because it's soft. The way that it's kind of splayed out here actually works to my advantage because I can kind of dust things on. So I'll use these old brushes. So I never throw away my old brushes until I really need to. Eventually these brushes here will become like this, and then this one will go away, and I'll start using those as my old working brushes. So anyway, I generally have about maybe 15-20 brushes sitting around my workbench when I'm starting a project, and through the project I'll probably go through most of them from time to time, switching off here and there as I see fit for whatever it is I'm working on. Okay, we're ready to get started here, and the first thing that I'm going to do, and the first thing I recommend everybody were to work on, is to add a coat of primer overall for the entire finish. This does a couple of things, especially on a model like this. First, it prepares the surface for painting. That's just the most basic thing it does. But especially on a model like this where we've got mixed media, we've got resin, we've got photo etch, we've got styrene, we really want to unify those surfaces because paint reacts to all those things in a little bit slightly different way, coverage-wise. So the first thing we want to do is put a light misting of primer. Keep in mind, we don't want to coat this thing heavily. We don't want to, erase the details. We don't want it to pool up. We don't want it to drip, but we want good coverage. And what I've done is I've decanted some primer and I put it into my airbrush here.
What does decanted mean?
Decanted means it's come from an aerosol can.
Okay.
So a rattle can, and some can, and I have just shoot from the rattle can onto the model. Then that works or can work. The problem is that you risk over coverage. It comes out pretty fast, and by the time you get to the hard to reach place down here, you've really coated this area up here. So decanting or spraying it into another jar and then pouring it into your airbrush cup is a good way just to get it to a tool that allows you to get into these smaller spaces. Keep in mind the airbrush is a tool designed to work with this type of a small item here. So, choose the right thing for what you're doing.
Right, and one thing I want to point out, I've never actually seen the type of holder you have there. It looks like it's a side load of siphon feed kind of thing.
Yeah, side load siphon feed, and I've gotten used to it. I like it. It basically sits up here and locks in with friction. It just pulls right out.
Right.
And you can see I kind of hold it, I kind of twist it closer to the body here, and I've got my finger on the bottom here just to make sure it doesn't fall off. It's just something I've gotten used to doing. the trouble with these, and you just have to be careful, is that you'll spill your paint out, which happens from time to time. So you just want to make sure your brush is always on a, upright position. You're not twisting it around. It's better to try to move the model around than it is to move the airbrush around.
Right, and the advantage of this really is that the reservoir is not sitting on top of the brush, so you have a little bit better visual.
I don't know if there's an advantage or probably there's more disadvantages with this type. My gravity feed here does have a lid that goes on the top here, so I can't spill this even if I wanted to.
Right.
So theoretically, this is probably the better method to deliver paint. I just happened to pick this one up. This was hooked up to the airbrush after testing, so this is the one I'm using at the moment.
Alrighty.
So I'm going to go ahead and get started with this. This will take a couple seconds. But you can see I'm just kind of coming in here. It's probably a good idea to start, like I was saying, in the hard to reach places, because there'll be overspray that's going to get other places. So if we aim for the hard to reach places, we're sure to get those before we get accumulation building up on the outside surfaces.
Right.
So I'm just going to kind of come in here, and you can see part of airbrushing is it's kind of a pause and go. You don't just and have one continual motion. It's kind of shoot, let it go, shoot, let it go. And notice my brush is kind of going across, keeping my distance from where I'm painting to the tip relatively similar. So I'm going up this side.
Right.
Let's see, I'm going to try to get behind the radiator here, so I'm just going to kind of spin my model around and get these other surfaces in here. I'm kind of concentrating on the engine first because that's obviously the most difficult parts to hit right now. And you can see in here where we've got all these little wires and stuff which looked really exposed and kind of out of place. The primer starts unifying it and everything starts to look more realistic. One thing when you do photo etch, like on this front grate here, you do have to be kind of careful with the photo etch and paint. If you put it on too heavy, it will actually web between those little fine meshes, and that's something you really don't want to do, and it's very hard to clean up. So when you do this, that's a light misting, let it accumulate slowly. We call them piss coats basically, which is just
Right.
a little touch of paint on there. And you can see, especially against the white, I'll do it on this side. My first level of pass through is really not very heavy. The accumulation comes with the second and third pass on this, and that's important. And a lot of the painting I'll be doing is in that similar manner. We really want to build up in layers, and I'll keep reinforcing that point as we go through this process. And this paint and most primers dry fairly quickly, and so by the time I've worked back here, I know that this is dry up here, so I don't really have much hesitation of lightly touching this to spin it around. And that just comes from doing this a lot. You kind of learn the drying properties of your paints.